There is a silence that precedes greatness, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something gathering itself. The silence before a storm finds its voice. The silence of a man who has decided, fully and without reservation, what he is willing to die for. That silence lived in the hearts of a brotherhood so singular, so exact in their purpose, that nearly 1,000 years after their dissolution, the world still cannot stop speaking their name. The Knights Templar. Say those 3 words in almost any corner of the civilized world, and something stirs. A recognition, a weight, as though the name itself carries memory, not merely of history, but of something older, something that touches the part of the human spirit that has always been drawn to devotion, to sacrifice, and to the terrifying beauty of absolute conviction. But who were they truly? Strip away the centuries of legend, set aside the whispers of buried treasure, of secret rites, of coded symbols carved into stone by torchlight. Who were the men beneath the white mantles? Who were the hands that gripped the swords? They were, in the simplest telling, warriors who had chosen God. And in that choosing, they became something the medieval world had never quite seen before, and has never quite seen since. It was the year 1179. Jerusalem had fallen to the Crusaders just 2 decades prior, and the Holy City, though held by Christian hands, was a dangerous place to reach. Pilgrims making the long and perilous journey from Europe to the sacred sites of Christendom were routinely robbed, brutalized, and murdered along the roads of the Holy Land. The roads were lawless. The desert was merciless. And the faithful were dying for their faith before they ever arrived to express it. Into this crisis stepped a French knight named Hugues de Paillet, and with him 8 companions, 9 men. That was the beginning. 9 men who approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with an offer that was, by any measure, extraordinary. They would protect the pilgrims. They would patrol the roads. They would ask for no payment. They required only a place to sleep, the blessing of the church, and the freedom to serve. Baldwin gave them quarters on the Temple Mount, on the ruins of what was believed to be Solomon's temple itself. And so they took their name, the poor fellow, soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, the Knights Templar. 9 men, housed in a temple of ancient stone, vowed to poverty, chastity, and obedience, riding out each dawn to stand between the faithful and the violence of the world. It should have been a footnote. It became a phenomenon. Within a single generation, the order had grown into something no one had planned and everyone, it seemed, had been waiting for. Donations poured in from across Europe. Land, money, sons. Noble families sent their finest young men to take the vows. Kings and popes extended their protection. By the mid-12th century, the Templars numbered in the thousands, held properties across the length of Christendom, and fielded a fighting force so disciplined, so ferocious, and so utterly without fear of death, that their enemies, seasoned warriors, hardened by their own long traditions of battle, openly spoke of them with a reverence that bordered on dread. Understand what that means. In an age when warfare was the highest profession, when men had spent lifetimes perfecting the art of killing and surviving, the Knights Templar stood apart. They did not fight to survive. They fought because they had already surrendered the outcome to God. A Templar knight was forbidden to retreat unless outnumbered by more than 3 to 1. They charged heavy cavalry lines on horseback with the same calm with which other men poured morning water. They held positions that common sense said could not be held. They died in formations so precise and so resolute that chroniclers on both sides of the battlefield wrote of them with something approaching awe. These were not merely soldiers. These were men who had found, in discipline and devotion, a kind of freedom that the rest of the world could barely comprehend. And yet, they vanished. In the space of a single October morning, in the year 1307, they were gone. arrested, scattered, tried, burned, an order 2 centuries in the making, dissolved in the course of a few political seasons by a king who feared them and a pope who owed him. But ideas, it turns out, are not so easily arrested. The Templars left behind more than treasure maps and conspiracy. They left behind a question that still echoes, faintly, persistently, through the corridors of history. What does it mean to give everything? That is the question we will follow. Settle in. This is their story. Every great institution begins not with a document, but with a feeling that something is missing, that the world, in its current arrangement, has left a particular gap, a shape of need that nothing yet created has been able to fill. The greatest founders in history are not, at their core, builders. They are recognizers. They see the gap before anyone else thinks to look for it, and they walk into it with their whole lives. Hugues Defied was such a man. We know relatively little about him in the way that modern biography would demand. No portraits survive, no personal letters written in a reflective mood, no journals cataloguing his doubts or his certainties. What we know of him comes filtered through chroniclers and papal correspondence and the dry administrative language of church records. And yet, through all of that, a man emerges, a man of unusual patience, of long vision, of the particular kind of stubbornness that does not announce itself as stubbornness, but simply refuses to stop. He was a nobleman from the Champagne region of France, likely born sometime around 1070, which would have made him a man already approaching 50 when he founded the order. This is worth pausing on. He was not a young idealist, feverish with the first heat of conviction. He was a seasoned man, who had already made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, who had seen with his own eyes the condition of the roads, the vulnerability of the faithful, the indifference of the violence that prowled the margins of the Holy Land. He had returned to France, he had thought, and then, with the quiet decisiveness of a man who has finished deliberating, he went back. This time, he did not go alone. The 8 men who rode with Hugues Defied to Jerusalem in 1119 were not random. They were known to him, men of similar standing, similar faith, similar willingness to walk away from comfort towards something they believed in. Among them was his own relative, Godfrey de Saint-Omer, a knight from the Low Countries who would become one of the order's most steady early pillars. They presented themselves to King Baldwin II, not with demands, but with an offer. And this distinction matters enormously, because it speaks to the particular genius of what Hugues Defied understood about power and persuasion. He did not arrive asking for an army or for lands or for recognition. He arrived asking only to serve, to be given a task and the merest scaffold of support with which to accomplish it. Baldwin was a pragmatic king in a difficult situation. Jerusalem was Christian in name, but the kingdom surrounding it was thin, stretched across inhospitable terrain, perpetually threatened, and chronically short of the kind of reliable men that any serious military endeavor requires. 9 sworn knights, asking for nothing but lodging and the freedom to patrol. This was, by any calculation, a remarkable gift. Baldwin accepted. He gave them space in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which the Crusaders had identified, with a confidence born more of hope than archaeology, as the site of Solomon's Temple. And there, in that ancient and loaded place, 9 men set up their simple quarters. They slept, it is said, on straw. They shared horses. They owned collectively almost nothing, and they began. For the first 9 years, the order existed in something very close to obscurity. 9 knights, even sworn, even devout, cannot patrol an entire kingdom. They were a gesture toward a solution more than a solution itself. The roads remained dangerous. The pilgrims still died. And the wider church, busy with its own enormous machinery of politics and theology and ambition, paid the little brotherhood on the Temple Mount very little attention. But Hugues de Payens was patient, in the way that only a man with a long plan can be patient. He understood that what the order needed, what would transform it from a noble experiment into something permanent and powerful, was legitimacy. Official, papal, irrefutable legitimacy. And to get that, he needed to go back to Europe. In 1127, he did exactly that. What followed was one of the most consequential lobbying efforts in the history of the medieval world. Hugues de Payens traveled through France and England, speaking to kings and bishops and nobility, presenting his case with the kind of calm, methodical persuasion that had clearly served him well his entire life. The response was remarkable. Donations came, recruits came, and most critically of all, the attention of the most influential churchman of the age arrived, not as a polite acknowledgement, but as a full-throated, passionate endorsement. His name was Bernard of Clairvaux, and his involvement changed everything. Bernard was, in the early 12th century, what we might today call a force of nature, wrapped in a monk's habit. He was the head of the Cistercian order, a theologian of extraordinary intellectual power, a preacher whose sermons could move entire crowds to tears and to action, and a man whose letters carried weight in the courts of kings and in the chambers of popes. When Bernard of Clairvaux spoke about something, the Christian world listened. Hugues de Payens came to him with his vision, and Bernard caught fire. It was Bernard who wrote, on behalf of the Knights Templar, one of the most extraordinary documents of the medieval age, a treatise called De Lauda Novae Militiae, which translates with a simplicity that belies its depth as in praise of the new knighthood. In it, Bernard articulated something that had never been quite so clearly expressed before, the idea of the warrior monk, the man who was simultaneously soldier and saint, who wielded a sword in the name of God, not in spite of his devotion, but as an expression of it. He contrasted the Templar knight sharply with the secular knights of the age, men who, in Bernard's withering assessment, fought for vanity, for glory, for land and gold and the admiration of women. These secular knights decked themselves in fine armor and silks, he wrote, and called it honor. The Templar wore plain wool and kept his hair cropped and his beard unshaved. He did not joust for entertainment. He did not attend tournaments. He trained for one purpose and one purpose only, to be useful in the defense of the righteous. Bernard's pen gave the Templars their theology. His voice gave them their reputation. And when the Council of Troyes convened in January of 1129, at least partly through his influence and advocacy, the order received something it could never have purchased or seized or argued its way to independently. It received a rule. The rule of the Templars was, in its own quiet way, as significant a document as the order's founding itself. Drawn up under Bernard's guidance, it governed every aspect of a Templar's life, with a completeness that left almost nothing to personal interpretation. A knight would own nothing. Whatever was given to him belonged to the order. He would eat in silence while scripture was read aloud. He would sleep fully clothed and with a light burning through the night, so that he was always ready, never soft, never caught in the deep comfort of a private darkness. He would confess his sins regularly, attend religious offices multiple times each day, and subordinate his own will entirely to that of the Grand Master and the chain of command that flowed from him. He could not correspond with his family without permission. He could not hunt for sport, though he could hunt the lion, that creature of symbolic danger, which the rule permitted with what reads, across the centuries, almost like a dry sense of humor. He could not have a woman, could not speak lightly of women, could not receive a kiss from any female relative, not his mother, not his sister, not even at greeting or farewell. These were not suggested practices, they were laws. And the man who accepted the white mantle of the Templar accepted them absolutely, publicly, and for the remainder of his life. Some men, reading these conditions, would flinch. Some would find in them a kind of suffocation, the self buried alive beneath regulation and routine. But for the men who came to the Templars in their thousands across the 12th century, the rule was not a cage. It was a relief, because the rule meant clarity, and clarity, for a man who has decided to give his life to something larger than himself, is among the greatest gifts the world can offer. There is a freedom in knowing exactly what you are, exactly what is expected of you, and exactly where you stand in relation to every other man around you. The Templars did not spend their days negotiating their identity. They had already settled the question. They knew. And so, from 9 men in borrowed quarters on an ancient temple mount, the order grew. By the 1130s, they had properties across France, England, Portugal, Aragon, and the Italian states. By mid-century, they were a standing military force of several thousand knights, sergeants, and auxiliaries. A professional army at a time when professional armies, in the modern sense, barely existed. They answered to no king. They paid taxes to no bishop. They owed fealty to the Pope alone, which meant, in the political reality of the 12th century, that they moved through the world with a freedom and an autonomy that secular rulers found, depending on the moment, either enormously useful or deeply unsettling. And still they rode out, each dawn, into the desert heat and the mountain cold, into ambushes and open battles and the long grinding sieges of crusader warfare. They were not perfect men. No institution built by human hands has ever housed perfect men. But they were something rarer than perfect. They were consistent in a world of shifting allegiances, of lords who changed sides and popes who changed policies and kings who made promises with the shelf life of bread. The Templars were consistent. You knew what they were. You knew what they would do. And in the long, brutal, complicated theater of the Crusades, that consistency was worth more than any treasure. It was worth, as it turned out, an entire civilization's trust. Power, in the medieval world, wore a particular face. It wore armor. It sat on horseback. It announced itself through banners and heraldry, through the crash of lances and the measured thunder of a cavalry charge. Power was visible, physical, impossible to misread, and the Knights Templar had that power in abundance, the kind that men can see and measure and fear. But the Templars, as the 12th century deepened into the 13th, were quietly building a second kind of power, one that wore no armor at all, one that did not announce itself with banners or the sound of hooves on dry earth. They were building the architecture of money, and in doing so they changed the world in ways that outlasted every battle they ever fought, every castle they ever garrisoned, every pilgrim road they ever rode. But we will arrive there in time, because before the ledger there was the sword. And the sword, in the hands of the Templar, was a thing the medieval world had genuinely never reckoned with before. To understand what the Templars were as a fighting force, you have to first understand what warfare looked like in the 12th century, and how thoroughly the Templars defied its conventions. Medieval armies were, by and large, gathered things. A king would call upon his lords would call upon their knights, and a force would assemble, motivated by obligation, by self-interest, by the promise of plunder or land or status. These were not professional soldiers in the modern sense. They were men with other lives, other loyalties, other considerations pulling at them constantly. They might fight brilliantly one morning and dissolve into factional argument by afternoon. They might refuse a tactically obvious order because it conflicted with some private point of honor. They might simply go home when the season turned, and their personal calculus of risk and reward shifted. The Templars operated in a different universe entirely. They had no homes to go back to. no private interests to protect, no harvests to oversee, no estates to manage, no families awaiting their return. They had, by the terms of their vows, surrendered all of it. What they had instead was each other, the rule, and the absolute authority of their commanders. A chain of command that was observed not because disobedience would be punished, though it would be, but because the men in that chain had chosen it, had walked to it freely and knelt before it willingly. This made them, in military terms, something very close to terrifying. The formation the Templars used in heavy cavalry engagements was called the esquielle, a tightly compressed column, riding knee to knee, each man's shield overlapping with the man beside him, lances leveled in absolute unison. When the Templar cavalry charged, they did not spread out and sweep across a field in the loose, individualistic style that many medieval knights preferred. They compressed, they tightened, they hit their target like a single fist rather than 10 separate fingers. The effect on enemy formations, documented repeatedly by chroniclers on both sides of Crusader conflicts, was catastrophic. The Saracen commander Saladin, one of the finest military minds of the medieval age, a man who rarely permitted himself public expressions of alarm, is recorded as having instructed his forces to specifically target Templar knights before all other opponents, not because they were the most heavily armored, though they often were, not because they carried the finest weapons, though they carried good ones, but because, left in the field, they simply would not stop. An ordinary knight, facing odds that clearly favored the enemy, would reassess, would look for the edge that calculation could find. The Templar knight was forbidden by his rule from retreating unless the ratio of enemies exceeded 3 to 1. 3 to 1. Against ordinary men, that is a counsel of madness. Against Templars, it was merely a statement of theology, an expression of the belief that God's purpose would not be defeated by arithmetic. The Battle of Montgisard in 1177 stands as perhaps the single most dramatic illustration of what Templar ferocity could accomplish. A force of Crusader cavalry, including a contingent of Templars led by Grand Master Odo de Saint-Amand, rode out to meet a Saladin-led army that outnumbered them by a factor that military historians still debate, but conservatively estimate at 5 to 1. Saladin had scattered his forces, believing the Crusaders contained. He was wrong. The Templar charge struck his rear guard with such sudden, concentrated violence that his formation broke, not bent, not wavered, but broke. And what began as a Saracen campaign turned into a rout. Saladin escaped. He barely escaped. He is said to have ridden away on a racing camel, surrounded by his personal guard, the dust of his own army's collapse rising behind him. The man who nearly caught him was a Templar. But battle, for all its drama, was not where the Templars spent most of their time, and it was not, ultimately, where their deepest impact on the medieval world was made. The Crusader states, the fragile Christian kingdoms carved from the Holy Land after the First Crusade, required something beyond intermittent military heroism to survive. They required infrastructure. They required logistics. They required the ability to move men and supplies and, crucially, money across enormous distances, through territories that were at any given moment either openly hostile or quietly dangerous. The Templars, almost by accident, and then quite deliberately, became the solution to this problem. And in becoming that solution, they invented something the world would spend the next 8 centuries refining and elaborating. They invented modern banking. The concept sounds dramatic when stated that simply, and perhaps it is a slight overreach, as all dramatic historical summaries are, but only a slight one. What the Templars created, beginning in the mid-12th century and developing with increasing sophistication through the 13th, was the first large-scale system of transferable financial credit in the Western world. Here is how it worked, at its most essential. A pilgrim, or a merchant, or a nobleman raising funds for a crusade, would arrive at a Templar house in, say, Paris or London or Genoa. He would deposit his money or valuables with the Templar treasurer there. He would receive a letter. This letter, written in a coded script that only Templar administrators could read, described the nature and size of the deposit. The pilgrim would then carry this letter, which was infinitely lighter and infinitely safer than a bag of silver coins, across the length of the known world. When he arrived at his destination, he would present the letter at the Templar house there, and he would receive his funds. No coins had moved, no silver had crossed the mountains or braved the sea routes. Only information had traveled, only a piece of paper containing a coded truth carried in the pocket of a man who could walk where a cart full of money could not. This was, in essence, the letter of credit, the forerunner of the bank draft, the conceptual ancestor of every wire transfer, every digital payment, every abstraction of value from physical substance that underpins the entire modern global economy. The Templars did not think of it this way, of course. They thought of it as a practical solution to a practical problem. How do you move wealth safely across a dangerous world? You don't. You move information instead, and let the wealth wait where it is safe until the information arrives to claim it. The simplicity of the insight is, in retrospect, breathtaking, and it did not stop there. As the order's financial operations grew in complexity and geographic reach, they developed what amounted to an entire banking system with all of the instruments we would recognize today. They issued loans to kings, to other nobles, to merchants undertaking long-distance trade. They charged interest on those loans, though the church's official prohibition on usury required this to be managed with a certain theological delicacy, usually by recategorizing interest payments as administrative fees or rental charges. They held deposits, managed estates, settled debts between third parties, and at various times served as the treasurers of entire kingdoms. The Templars held the royal treasury of France for a significant portion of the 12th and 13th centuries. The English crown banked with them. The papacy itself used their financial network for the movement of funds across Europe, kings who were embarking on crusades. And the crusading enterprise was, among its many other features, enormously expensive. Came to the Templars not as supplicants, but as clients, because the Templars were simply the most reliable financial institution in existence. Think about what this means. Set alongside their military function, here was an organization that could lend you the money to mount a crusade, transport you and your army safely to the Holy Land, on ships they owned, garrison the castles along your route, ride into battle beside you with absolute fearlessness, and then hold the treasury of your kingdom in your absence so that it was still there when you returned. They were, in the fullest sense, indispensable. And indispensability is its own form of power, quieter than the charge of a cavalry column, but in many ways more durable. Armies can be defeated, castles can be taken, but the man who holds your money and knows your debts occupies a position that pure military force cannot easily dislodge. The kings of Europe understood this. Most of them chose to be grateful for it. For a while, there is a network of buildings spread across the length of medieval Europe that stands as the physical record of the Templars' reach. Their commanderies, the local administrative houses that served as both headquarters and financial branches, were established in virtually every significant city and many insignificant ones. Temple in London, from which an entire district of that city still takes its name. The Temple in Paris, a massive fortified compound that would, centuries later, serve as the prison of a French king. Templar churches, round in their design as a deliberate echo of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, still standing today in Portugal, in England, in France, their stones worn smooth by time, but their geometry intact, their purpose still legible to anyone who stops and looks. These buildings were not merely administrative offices. They were statements, they said. in the language of stone and proportion that the medieval world understood better than we do, that the order was here, that it was permanent, that it had planted itself in the earth of civilization with the intention of remaining. For 2 full centuries that intention was not questioned. The order that had begun with 9 men and borrowed lodgings had become something unprecedented, a sovereign power without a territory, a state without a nation, an institution that answered to God and the Pope, that owed nothing to any king, that moved money and men across the known world with a fluency that no other entity could match. They were, in the truest sense of a word that is often used carelessly, an empire. Not an empire of land, not an empire of conquest and occupation, but an empire of trust, of demonstrated, accumulated, relentlessly maintained trust. Built one kept promise, one repaid loan, one defended pilgrim, one held battle line at a time. For 200 years, no one had found a reason to stop trusting them. That, as it happens, was about to change. Not because the Templars had changed, but because the world around them had. Greatness, when it begins to fade, rarely announces itself. There is no single morning when an institution wakes and finds itself diminished. No clear line in the calendar where strength ends and vulnerability begins. The erosion is gradual, geological almost, the slow wearing of something solid by forces that, taken individually, seem almost trivial. A shift in politics here, a military reversal there, a king who looks at an old alliance and begins, quietly, to wonder whether it still serves him. The Knights Templar did not fall because they became weak. They did not fall because they grew corrupt, or lazy, or faithless. Though their enemies would spend considerable energy arguing otherwise, they fell because the world they had been built to serve slowly, and then quite suddenly, ceased to exist around them. And when the world that needs you disappears, even the greatest among the indispensable become exposed. To understand what happened to the Templars, you have to understand what happened to Jerusalem. The entire moral and practical architecture of the order rested on a foundation with a name, a location, and a set of coordinates on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. Jerusalem was not merely a city to the medieval Christian imagination. It was the axis of the world, the place where heaven and earth had most recently and most dramatically intersected, the site of the crucifixion and the resurrection, of the temple, of the defining events of the faith that organized all of European civilization. To hold Jerusalem was to hold something more than territory. It was to hold a proof, a physical, geographic demonstration that Christendom was favored, that the crusading enterprise was righteous, that the sacrifice of 2 centuries of men and money and effort had been received and honored by God. When Jerusalem fell to Saladin in 1187, the shock that moved through Christian Europe was not merely political or military, it was existential. It shook the foundations of a worldview. If Jerusalem could be lost, if Saladin's armies could walk into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, then what did that mean? What was God saying, and to whom? The Templars fought at the Horns of Hattin, the catastrophic battle that preceded Jerusalem's fall, with exactly the courage their rule demanded of them. They charged into a situation that was already tactically lost, because retreat was not permitted, because the cause was worth dying for, because they were Templars, and this was what Templars did. Most of them died there. Those captured were offered a choice, conversion or execution. Almost to a man they chose the sword. Saladin, who executed them personally or oversaw their execution with what the chroniclers describe as visible satisfaction, is also recorded as having expressed a particular admiration for their resolution. Even an enemy could see what they were. But admiration did not return Jerusalem. The city was recovered, briefly and partially, through diplomatic negotiation during the Sixth Crusade in 1229, a transaction that scandalized much of the Christian world, including the Templars, because it involved treating with the enemy rather than defeating him. The Templar Grand Master at the time openly refused to recognize the agreement, a position that was theologically coherent and politically disastrous, and very much in keeping with the Templar character throughout history. Jerusalem changed hands again and again, and each time it did, the crusading ideal, that great luminous conviction that had sent 2 centuries of European men eastward into the heat and dust and violence of the Holy Land, dimmed a little further. The final blow came not in Jerusalem but in a city further north on the Syrian coast, a city called Acre. Acre was the last significant Christian stronghold in the Holy Land. By 1291, it was all that remained of the Crusader presence in the region. A walled city on the sea, surrounded by the forces of the Mamluk Sultanate, holding on with the particular desperate tenacity of something that knows itself to be the last of its kind. But Templars were there. Of course they were there. They manned the walls, they led the sorties, they fought with every resource their depleted numbers could bring to bear against an enemy force that outnumbered them so vastly that the mathematics of it were almost beside the point. On the 18th of May 1291, the walls of Acre were breached. The Grand Master, William of Beaujeu, was killed in the fighting, struck by an arrow while directing the defense, dying on the walls of the last city, a death that had the quality of something almost scripted, almost too precisely emblematic to be accidental. A Grand Master of the Knights Templar, dying in armor, defending a Christian city against the enemies of the faith. It was the death the Order had always prepared its men for. It was the death that made perfect sense within the theology and the tradition and the 2 centuries of accumulated purpose. It was also, in its way, the death of the Order itself, even though the Order would continue breathing for another 16 years. The Templars who survived Acre sailed west. They had nowhere east to go. And here is where the long sunset truly began, because an organization built for a specific purpose, suddenly deprived of that purpose, faces a crisis that no amount of wealth or property or institutional prestige can fully resolve. The question, simple, devastating, impossible to answer without a satisfying geographical location, was this: what are the Knights Templar for, now that there is no Holy Land to defend? The Order, to its credit, did not simply dissolve into comfortable retirement. The leadership argued, with genuine conviction, for a new crusade, for the mustering of forces, the securing of alliances, the reclamation of what had been lost. Grand Masters sent memoranda to popes. They outlined strategies. They proposed timelines. They argued, with the patient, methodical insistence of men who had been arguing the same point for 150 years and saw no reason to stop, that the enterprise was not finished, but merely paused. The popes nodded. The kings of Europe listened politely. And then nothing happened, because the political reality of late 13th century Europe was very different from the zealous, possibility-drunk atmosphere of the First Crusade. The kings had other wars now, wars with each other, wars of consolidation and territorial ambition on their own continent. They had debts. They had domestic crises. They had, in short, their own concerns, and those concerns were urgent and immediate, in a way that another military expedition to the eastern Mediterranean simply was not. The Templars, stripped of their primary purpose, continued to exist. They managed their properties. They maintained their financial networks. They trained. They observed the rule. They were still enormously wealthy, still organizationally sophisticated, still possessed of all the institutional machinery that 2 centuries of growth had produced. But they were also, for the first time in their history, vulnerable to a question they had never had to answer before. Why should you continue to exist? In France, In the last years of the 13th century, a king was watching them and turning that question over in his mind with increasing attention. His name was Philip IV. History would call him Philip the Fair, a reference to his physical appearance, the fine-boned, composed face that gave no indication of the cold and comprehensive ambition working behind it. He was one of the most capable and most ruthless monarchs of his age, a man who understood power with an intimacy that he had demonstrated repeatedly and without sentiment throughout his reign. Philip was also, by the early 1300s, catastrophically in debt. He had fought expensive wars against England, against Flanders, against the perpetual internal frictions of French nobility. He had levied taxes until the resources of the taxation were approaching their limits. He had, in one particularly audacious move, expelled the Jewish population of France and seized their assets, a monstrous act that had provided temporary relief and no long-term solution. He owed the Templars money, significant money, the kind that does not become more comfortable with time. And the Templars, sitting in their Paris temple compound with their ledgers and their vaults and their centuries of accumulated wealth, were becoming, in the specific, cold way that Philip IV looked at the world, less a useful institution and more an obstacle, a very wealthy obstacle, a stateless, sovereign, powerful, wealthy obstacle that answered to the Pope and not the King of France, and that held financial records documenting the French crown's considerable indebtedness in exhaustive and embarrassing detail. Philip began to think. The thinking took time. Philip was not reckless. He was, in many ways, the opposite of reckless. A man who moved slowly toward large goals, who built his cases carefully, who understood that the destruction of something as formidable as the Knights Templar required preparation and allies and a narrative that the world could accept. He found his narrative in rumor. Rumors about the Templars had circulated at the edges of respectable conversation for decades, the inevitable byproduct of an institution that operated with significant secrecy, that conducted its internal ceremonies behind closed doors, that had accumulated enough enemies over 2 centuries to ensure a steady supply of dark speculation. What happened at Templar initiations? What oaths were sworn in private? What did the inner circles of the order actually believe, beneath the public armor of Orthodox Christian devotion? Philip's agents gathered these rumors, shaped them, gave them the weight of testimony, finding men, some of them disgruntled former Templars, some of them prisoners with reasons to say what they were told to say, who would attest to specific, concrete, deeply scandalous accusations. The charges that emerged were calculated for maximum devastation. Initiates were said to deny Christ during their admission ceremonies, to spit on the cross, to trample it underfoot. They were said to worship an idol called Baphomet, a figure whose precise nature the testimonies described with helpfully lurid inconsistency. Sodomy was alleged to be not merely permitted within the order, but actively encouraged. Their priests were said to not consecrate the host during Mass, rendering every Templar act of worship an elaborate, blasphemous theater. The charges were almost certainly false, almost certainly constructed, assembled from the raw material of old rumor, and shaped by the political needs of a king who wanted justification for what he had already decided to do. But they were designed for an age in which heresy was not merely a religious category, but a political weapon, and in which the machinery of inquisitorial procedure, once set in motion, had a momentum that was very difficult for even the innocent to survive. Philip brought Pope Clement I into the conspiracy, and conspiracy is not too strong a word. Clement was a French pope, elected through processes that Philip had influenced, occupying the papacy from Avignon rather than Rome, dependent on French goodwill in ways that made his independence largely theoretical. He resisted, initially, with more conviction than one might have expected from a man in his position. But Philip's pressure was relentless, and Clement eventually yielded. The trap was set. All that remained was to spring it. On the night of the 12th of October, 1307, sealed orders went out across France. They were delivered to royal officers in every corner of the kingdom, bailiffs, seneschals, the machinery of royal administration working with a coordination and a secrecy that, in an age before telegraph or telephone, was itself a remarkable logistical achievement. The orders were not to be opened until dawn on Friday the 13th, when the sun rose on that morning whose date has carried a faint shadow of unease ever since, though the superstition's direct connection to the Templar arrests is historically disputed. The seals were broken simultaneously across France. The orders inside were the same everywhere. Arrest all Templars, seize all Templar property, hold them for questioning by the Inquisition. No warning had been given, no indication had leaked. The order, for all its intelligence and its organizational sophistication, had not seen it coming, or if some among them had glimpsed the shape of it, they had not moved quickly enough. By nightfall on Friday the 13th of October, 1307, nearly every Templar in France was in chains. 2 centuries of unwavering service, 187 years of held battle lines, and managed treasuries, and defended pilgrims, and kept promises, ended in a single morning by sealed orders and the calculated patience of a king who owed them money and wanted a different world. The silence that followed was, in its way, as heavy as the silence that had preceded their founding. Something was gathering again, but this time it was not greatness. There is a particular cruelty in the law when the law has already decided, when the verdict exists before the evidence is gathered, when the machinery of justice is operated not by the pursuit of truth, but by the requirements of a conclusion that powerful men have already reached, and require only the formality of procedure to legitimize. History has seen this cruelty exercised many times, in many places, across many centuries, but rarely has it been applied to an institution of such stature, such demonstrated service, such accumulated and documented record of sacrifice. What happened to the Knights Templar in the 7 years between their arrest in 1307 and the formal dissolution of the order in 1312 was, in the plainest terms, a show trial conducted on a civilizational scale. It was theater dressed as justice. It was accusation dressed as inquiry. And it worked, as such things tend to work, not because it was convincing to the careful observer, but because it was conducted with sufficient official gravity that the world, on the whole, chose to believe it easier to accept than to resist. But the men at the center of it, the knights in their cells, the old Grand Master in his tower, were not quite so easy to manage as Philip IV had perhaps imagined. The arrests of October 1307 swept up an estimated 2,000 Templars across France. They were taken to royal prisons, held in conditions that ranged from merely uncomfortable to deliberately brutal, and delivered into the hands of the Inquisition, the institutional mechanism of the medieval church, specifically designed to extract confession from those accused of heresy. The Inquisition's primary tool was torture. This was not, in the legal framework of the time, considered unusual or even particularly controversial. Torture was a standard instrument of medieval judicial procedure, applied to extract confessions that the law considered a necessary prerequisite for conviction in certain categories of crime. The inquisitors who applied it to the Templars were, in their own understanding of themselves, not sadists. They were technicians, men doing a necessary and unpleasant job in the service of truth and the preservation of the faith. The Templars broke. This requires saying clearly and without judgment, because the opposite conclusion, the romantic image of Templar knights enduring unspeakable torment in dignified silence, maintaining their innocence against every instrument of pain, is not what the historical record shows. Most of them broke. Under the systematic application of physical suffering, in the isolation of cells that cut them off from the brotherhood, that had structured their entire adult lives, separated from the rule and the community, and the shared identity that had given them their legendary fearlessness on the battlefield. The majority of the arrested knights eventually confessed. They confessed to denying Christ, to spitting on the cross, to the worship of Baphomet, to the various other charges that Philip's narrative required. They confessed in the specific, detailed language that the inquisitors found most useful, language that mapped neatly onto the accusations, that filled the procedural requirements of the trial, that gave the machinery of condemnation the fuel it needed to run. And here we must pause briefly and sit with the complexity of this, because the easy reading of these confessions is that they prove the guilt of the order, and the equally easy, equally insufficient reading is that they prove nothing at all, that tortured confessions are worthless by definition. The truth, as it so often does, sits in the harder, more uncomfortable middle ground. What the confessions tell us primarily is something about the nature of suffering and isolation and the limits of human endurance. What they tell us about the actual practices of the order is, by any serious historical standard, very little indeed. Many of the knights who confessed under torture immediately recanted when the instruments were removed. They stood before papal commissioners and said clearly that what they had said was not true, that they had said it because the alternative was intolerable. Some of them were burned for their recantations, because in the jurisprudence of the Inquisition, a man who confessed and then withdrew his confession was a relapsed heretic, and the penalty for that was the fire. They were burned for telling the truth, after being broken into telling a lie. Not all the Templars were in France when the arrests came. Some were in other kingdoms, in England, in Aragon, in Portugal, in Scotland, where the reception of Philip's orders was less immediate and less uniformly enthusiastic. In England, Edward II initially expressed disbelief and defended the order in correspondence with other European monarchs. In Portugal, the order was effectively absorbed into a new institution, the Order of Christ, rather than destroyed, and continued to operate for centuries. In Scotland, where papal authority had a more complicated relationship with local political reality, some Templar knights found a degree of shelter that France had not offered. These scattered survivals matter. They tell us that the destruction of the Templars was not an inevitable consequence of their own nature or their own failures, but a specific political act carried out in a specific place by a specific king for specific reasons. It was not a verdict delivered by history. It was a verdict delivered by Philip IV of France, and the rest of the world complied with it to varying degrees and with varying levels of genuine conviction. But in France, where the order was largest and the king's power most direct, the trial ground forward with the implacable patience of something that knows it controls all the relevant variables. Into the center of all this stepped one man, and it is in this man that the full tragedy and the full dignity of the order's ending are most completely concentrated. Jacques de Molay had been Grand Master of the Knights Templar since 1298. He was, by the autumn of 1307, an old man, somewhere in his 60s, which, in the physical calculus of the medieval world, made him genuinely elderly. A man who had spent his life in armor and campaign, carrying in his body the accumulated evidence of a career in violent service. He had been Grand Master during the fall of Acre. He had lobbied repeatedly and unsuccessfully for a new crusade. He had navigated the increasingly hostile political landscape of the early 14th century with a combination of dignity and, perhaps, a certain naivety about the depth of the danger gathering around him. He had, in fact, been in Paris at Philip's own invitation when the arrests came. He was a pallbearer at the funeral of the French Queen. He was an honored guest of the man who was even then preparing to destroy him. De Molay was arrested with the rest. He was brought before the Inquisition, and he, like so many of his brothers, eventually confessed to some of the charges, in terms sufficiently ambiguous to leave historians arguing about their precise meaning for 7 centuries. Whether the confession was extracted by torture, by the threat of torture, or by some more subtle form of pressure is not entirely clear from the surviving records. What is clear is that the confession was made. And then, in the months and years that followed, as the trial expanded and papal commissioners gathered testimony from hundreds of Templars across France, something shifted in Jacques de Molay. It is difficult to identify precisely when. The records do not give us his interior life with any generosity, but the direction of the shift is unmistakable. He began to fight back, not with weapons, not with cavalry and lancers and the massed formation charge that had defined the order he led. He fought back with testimony, with the laborious, procedurally complicated, personally dangerous act of standing before official bodies and asserting, against all the institutional pressure that Philip's apparatus could bring to bear, that the order was innocent. He was not alone in this. A significant number of Templar Knights, as the proceedings extended into 1308 and 1309 and beyond, chose to defend the order, to present themselves formally as defenders of an institution they insisted had been falsely accused. In Paris alone, several hundred Templars appeared before papal commissioners and offered to speak in the order's defense. This was not a small act of courage. These were men who had already been through the machinery of the Inquisition, who knew what recantation and resistance cost, who were offering themselves back to that machinery voluntarily. The papal commission's proceedings were slow, detailed, and ultimately overtaken by political events that moved faster than the legal process could accommodate. Philip was not inclined to wait. He had moved the Pope. He had secured the framework of condemnation. What remained was the formal act of dissolution, and he pressed for it with the impatience of a man who has been patient for a very long time and sees the finish line. At the Council of Vienne in 1312, Pope Clement V, acting under pressure that the available historical record makes no serious attempt to disguise, formally dissolved the Knights Templar, not condemned. The council itself had not reached a verdict of guilt with sufficient unanimity. Dissolved, suppressed, ended by papal decree without formal conviction, on the grounds that the scandal surrounding the order made its continued existence untenable. It was, in its way, a verdict that managed to be both devastating and unsatisfying simultaneously. The order was destroyed, but the question of its guilt was left formally unresolved, suspended in the institutional language of suppression rather than answered by the language of judgment. The Templar properties were transferred, in theory, to the Knights Hospitaller, though in practice significant portions of them found their way into the hands of the French crown through the particular alchemy of medieval political reality. The remaining Templars were to be allowed to live out their days in Hospitaller houses or in retirement, provided they had confessed and not relapsed into denial. Those who had continued to assert the order's innocence faced a different fate. On the 18th of March, 1314, on a small island in the Seine River in Paris, the Île des Juifs, the island of the Jews, 2 old men were brought out before a crowd and a panel of cardinals to hear the final reading of their sentence. One was Geoffrey de Charny, the preceptor of Normandy. The other was Jacques de Molay, Grand Master of the Knights Templar. The sentence was life imprisonment, the standard outcome for those who had confessed and were considered to have shown sufficient penitence to be spared the fire. Jacques de Molay listened to the sentence read, and then he did something that no one present, not the cardinals, not the royal officials, not the crowd gathered on the riverbank, had anticipated. He spoke. He stood before the assembled authority of the French crown and the Roman Church. An old man in chains, more than 6 years of imprisonment in his body, and he repudiated everything. He withdrew his confession. He stated clearly that the Order of the Knights Templar was innocent of the charges brought against it. He said that what he had confessed under duress, and that it was false, and that the only things he now considered worth confessing were the wrongs he had done to his order by confessing falsely in the first place. Geoffrey de Charny stood beside him and said the same. The cardinals looked at each other. Under the law of the Inquisition, this made the two men relapsed heretics. The sentence for relapsed heresy was death by fire. The cardinals did not have the authority to order this themselves. It required royal sanction and the determination of additional procedure. Philip IV of France did not require much time to deliberate. That same evening, as the sun went down over Paris, Jacques de Molay and Geoffrey de Charny were taken to the stake on the Île des Juifs and burned. Contemporary accounts describe de Molay dying with a composure that silenced the crowd. He is said to have asked to be turned to face the Cathedral of Notre Dame, so that his last sight would be the great church. He is said to have died without crying out. He is said to have called out from within the fire that God would judge his judges, that Philip IV and Pope Clement V would both be called before the divine court within the year. Clement V died 1 month later. Philip IV died before the year was out. History, which is usually careful about the literalness of such coincidences, has never been entirely sure what to do with this one. What remained when the fire went out and the crowd dispersed and the long, bitter 7-year prosecution of an institution reached its terminus on a small island in a Paris river was not nothing. It was something more difficult to assess than nothing. It was absence, the particular quality of absence that belongs only to things that were once immensely present, things that organize the space around them so completely that their removal leaves a shape, a negative impression, a silence that has the precise outline of what used to fill it. The Knights Templar were gone, but the shape they left behind. In the financial systems they had invented, in the military traditions they had refined, in the buildings they had built, and the roads they had made safe, and the kingdoms they had financed, and the battles they had fought, and the lines they had held past all reasonable expectation. That shape did not disappear with the last ember on the Île des Juifs. Shapes like that have a way of persisting. The world the Templars had helped to build continued. The money kept moving through systems they had designed. The letters of credit they had invented evolved, slowly and without acknowledgement of their origin, into the instruments of modern finance. The fortified houses they had built across Europe stood for centuries, their stones holding the geometry of a purpose that the institutions themselves had outlasted. And the questions they left behind, about devotion and power, and the vulnerability of the righteous to the machinations of the merely ambitious, those questions did not require stone to persist. They required only the particular human restlessness that cannot look at an injustice and feel at peace with it. The instinct that looks at Friday the 13th of October, 1307, and says, something was done there that should not have been done. That instinct has never fully quieted. It is still listening. Legacies are strange things. They do not always resemble the people or the institutions that created them. They grow in the dark, in the years and decades and centuries after the original thing has ended, fed by the imagination of those who come after, people who were not there, who cannot know with certainty, who fill the gaps between documented facts with the particular material that their own age finds most compelling. Sometimes a legacy hardens into myth. Sometimes it softens into symbol. Sometimes it does something stranger still. It becomes a mirror, reflecting back not the truth of what was, but the needs and fears and longings of whoever happens to be looking. The legacy of the Knights Templar has done all of these things in roughly equal measure across 700 years. And if we are honest, carefully, historically, unhurriedly honest, we find that the true legacy is more interesting than any of the myths, because the true legacy is not buried treasure, not secret bloodlines, not coded messages in cathedral stonework. The true legacy is woven into the fabric of the world we actually inhabit. It is in the way money moves. It is in the architecture of organized military service. It is in the very idea that an institution can exist above and beyond the authority of any single nation, answerable to a principle rather than a power. The Templars did not merely fight and bank and pray. They demonstrated something. And demonstrations, even when the demonstrators are gone, have a way of teaching. Begin with the financial system, because it is the most concrete and the most consequential and the most consistently under-acknowledged thread of Templar influence running through the modern world. The letter of credit that the Templars perfected in the 12th century did not die with the order. It was already too useful, already too deeply embedded in the commercial arteries of medieval Europe to be extracted without devastating the circulation of the entire system. The merchant classes of Italy, the Lombards, the Florentines, the great banking families who would define the Renaissance economy, inherited and elaborated the instruments the Templars had pioneered. The Medici did not invent the letter of credit, they refined it. They built upon foundations that had been laid by men in white mantles, riding between the commanderies of Christendom with coded documents in their saddlebags. Follow that thread forward, and it does not stop at the Medici. It runs through the development of European banking in the 15th and 16th centuries, through the establishment of the first national banks in the 17th, through the elaboration of credit instruments and financial abstraction that made the Industrial Revolution possible, and onward into the digital payment systems of the 21st century. Systems in which value moves as information, instantly and across any distance, which is the Templar insight restated in the language of fiber optic cable and encrypted data. Every time you make a transaction without physically moving money, every wire transfer, every credit card payment, every contactless tap of a device against a reader, you are in a lineage that is long and indirect but unbroken, using something the Knights Templar invented because they needed to get pilgrims' money safely from Paris to Jerusalem. The world is full of their fingerprints, and most people walking through it have never noticed. Their architectural legacy is more visible if you know what to look for. The round churches are the most obvious signature. The Templars built round, circular naves echoing the form of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the building in Jerusalem that represented the entire justification of the crusading enterprise. These round churches survive across Europe with a persistence that says something about the quality of Templar construction, and something else perhaps about the reluctance of subsequent generations to fully erase their presence. The Temple Church in London, consecrated in 1185, still stands in the heart of the legal district that takes its name from the order that built it. Its round nave, its carved stone effigies of medieval knights lying in the permanent repose of the honored dead, its atmosphere of accumulated time. These things draw visitors who may know nothing of the Templars but feel, in the building's specific gravity, that something serious happened here, that the stones have a memory, that the casual glance cannot quite exhaust. In Tomar, Portugal, the Convent of Christ, originally a Templar castle and chapter house, rises above the town in a state of preservation that allows a visitor to walk through spaces where Templar knights once moved in the ordinary business of their extraordinary lives. The Charola, the order's original oratory, is a 16-sided rotunda of such architectural confidence and beauty that it was simply incorporated, as the Templars were absorbed into the Order of Christ, into an ever-expanding complex that grew around it for the next 3 centuries. The Templars' part of it remains the heart of the whole, the original chamber around which everything else was built, the founding gesture that all subsequent elaboration has served to frame. These buildings are not relics in the sense of dead things preserved under glass. They are active, breathing presences in the landscapes they inhabit. The Temple Church still holds services. Tomar is still a living town, its identity inseparable from the hilltop fortress that watches over it. The stones are still doing their work, still saying, to whoever passes below them, that something was here that something was built to last, that the men who built it intended permanence. But it is in the realm of legend and imagination that the Templar legacy has proven most prolifically, most stubbornly alive. The sudden, violent suppression of 1307, the sealed orders, the simultaneous arrests, the secrecy of the charges, the suspicious timing of the deaths of both Pope and King within a year of de Molay's burning, created a narrative vacuum of extraordinary proportions. Into that vacuum across the centuries, human imagination poured everything it had. The treasure first. There has always been the treasure. When the arrests came on that October morning in 1307, the Templar treasury in Paris was found to be largely empty. The vaults that should have held the accumulated wealth of one of the richest institutions in medieval Europe contained far less than anyone had expected. Philip IV, who had counted heavily on the seizure of Templar assets to address his financial difficulties, found himself disappointed in a way that the records suggest he had not fully anticipated. Where had it gone? The question has never been conclusively answered. The most likely historical explanation is prosaic, that the order's wealth was primarily held in the form of lands and properties rather than liquid treasure, that significant assets had been moved in the days or weeks before the arrests by officers who had received some warning, and that the overall picture of Templar finances in 1307 was less dramatically solvent than Philip had assumed. Institutions, even wealthy ones, have debts and obligations. The Templars had been financing their own continuing operations for years, without the revenue streams that the active Crusades had once provided. But the prosaic explanation has never been satisfying to the human appetite for mystery. And so the legend of the Templar treasure grew through the centuries, collected detail and location and specificity, and eventually became one of the most durable and widely distributed treasure myths in the Western world. The treasure is said to be in the south of France, in the Languedoc, where Cathar heresy once bloomed, and the Templars had significant holdings. It is said to be in Scotland, smuggled there by knights who escaped the French arrests by sea and found shelter under the protection of Robert the Bruce, who had himself been excommunicated and had therefore nothing to lose by sheltering excommunicated men. The underground chambers of Rosslyn Chapel, that extraordinary piece of Scottish Gothic architecture, completed more than a century after the Templar dissolution, have been searched and speculated about, and written into conspiracy theories of almost inexhaustible invention. The Oak Island money pit in Nova Scotia has been connected, by minds willing to follow a sufficiently winding thread, to Templar escapes and Templar cargoes. The New World itself has been drawn into the orbit of Templar possibility, with theories proposing that Templar sailors, using maritime knowledge accumulated during their decades of Eastern Mediterranean naval operations, reached the Americas generations before Columbus. None of these theories have produced treasure. None of them have been confirmed by the documentary record, but their persistence, their remarkable, centuries-spanning, endlessly renewable vitality, tells us something important. Not about the Templars necessarily, about us, about the human need to believe that the story did not end on a river island in Paris in 1314. That something escaped, that the fire consumed the men but not the meaning. The Freemasons must be mentioned here, because in any serious discussion of Templar legacy they appear inevitably and require honest assessment. The claim, stated confidently by some Masonic traditions, disputed by most serious historians, is that Freemasonry is either descended from, or directly continuous with, the Knights Templar. That surviving Templars, scattered after the dissolution, carried their rites and their knowledge into the operative stonemason guilds of medieval Europe, and that these guilds eventually evolved into the speculative Freemasonry that emerged formally in the early 18th century. The historical evidence for direct institutional continuity is not strong. The gap between the Templar dissolution in 1312 and the establishment of the first Grand Lodge in London in 1717 is 400 years, and 400 years is a very long time for an underground tradition to maintain itself without leaving more documentary trace than the available record provides. What is more historically defensible is the idea of influence, of the Templar model, their structure of degrees and oaths and brotherhood, and esoteric knowledge reserved for inner circles, providing a template that was consciously or unconsciously echoed in later fraternal organizations. Whether or not the specific rituals were inherited, the shape of the thing, the hierarchical brotherhood, the sworn secrecy, the combination of practical purpose with spiritual aspiration has a distinctly Templar silhouette. The Knights Templar order exists today as a degree within Freemasonry in many countries, conferring rituals and symbolism that claim Templar lineage with varying degrees of historical seriousness. Whatever the precise nature of the connection, these living traditions represent, at minimum, a recognition that the Templar ideal, the fusion of discipline and devotion, of active service and interior spiritual life, retains its power to organize and inspire human beings, even in a world that the original Templars would have found unrecognizable in almost every particular. There is something else the Templars left behind that is perhaps less dramatic than treasure maps and secret societies, but more genuinely significant in its implications for how human civilization has organized itself. They demonstrated, for the first time on a large scale and over an extended period, that a non-state institution could operate across national boundaries with a sovereignty of its own, answerable to a principle rather than a territory, maintaining its coherence not through the loyalty that subjects owe to rulers but through the voluntary commitment that believers make to a shared purpose. This idea, the transnational institution, the organization that transcends the nation-state, is so fundamental to the architecture of the modern world that we rarely stop to notice how extraordinary it is. The United Nations, the International Red Cross, the Catholic Church in its post-Reformation form, the great international corporations and NGOs that operate simultaneously in dozens of jurisdictions, maintaining their own cultures and their own chains of accountability that exist parallel to but distinct from the authority of any single government. These things did not spring from nothing. They grew from a tradition of thinking about how large, complex, principled organizations can sustain themselves across borders and over time. And that tradition has among its earliest and most instructive examples the Poor Fellow, Soldiers of Christ, and of the Temple of Solomon, who for 200 years demonstrated that it could be done, that a transnational institution with genuine sovereignty and genuine purpose could function, could grow, could serve, could be trusted, that it could also be destroyed by a sufficiently powerful and sufficiently unscrupulous state actor is, perhaps, another part of the lesson, one that the architects of modern international institutions have not always absorbed as fully as they might. And so we arrive, at last, at the question with which we began. Not the question of what happened to the treasure, not the question of whether the charges were true, not even the question of whether Philip IV and Clement V faced divine judgment in the months after de Molay's burning, though one is permitted, at this distance, a small private opinion on the matter. The question with which we began was this: what does it mean to give everything? The Templars gave everything. In the most literal possible sense, they gave their property, their autonomy, their freedom of movement, their private lives, their names as individuals absorbed into the identity of the Brotherhood, and ultimately, on the walls of Acre and the field of Hattin and the stake on the Ile des Juifs, their lives. They gave everything to a cause that, measured by its stated territorial objectives, failed. Jerusalem was not held. The Holy Land was not secured. The crusading enterprise, to which they devoted their institutional existence, did not achieve its ultimate purpose. And yet, the world they helped to build, the financial systems, The military traditions, the administrative structures, the architectural legacy, the demonstration that principled institutions can transcend the boundaries of states. This world has outlasted every kingdom that existed in their time. It has outlasted the papacy that blessed them and then abandoned them. It has outlasted the French monarchy that destroyed them. It has outlasted nearly every institution that was their contemporary. And it continues in forms they could not have anticipated to shape the daily experience of billions of people who have never heard of the Council of Troyes or the rule of the Templars or the name of Hugues de Payens. This is what it means to give everything. Not that you win, not that the cause you serve achieves its specific articulated goals on the schedule you intended, but that the effort, sincere, total, disciplined, maintained without reservation through difficulty and defeat, and the long grinding patience of service, leaves something in the world, leaves a deposit, a residue of example, a shape that persists after the men who made it are gone. The Knights Templar were not perfect men. They were complicated, sometimes arrogant, sometimes politically naive, sometimes brutal in the way that all medieval warfare was brutal, products of their time in all the ways that products of their time inevitably are. They do not require sanctification to be worthy of attention. They require only honest understanding, the willingness to look at what they actually were, what they actually did, what they actually built, and to accord that reality the respect that sustained human effort in the service of genuine principle has always deserved. They rode out at dawn, into the heat and the violence and the impossible arithmetic of the battles they had sworn to fight. They held the line when the line should not have held. They kept the records when the records mattered. They built the buildings that are still standing, invented the instruments that are still in use, demonstrated the ideas that are still organizing human civilization. And then, on a cold March morning in 1340, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar stood in the fire on a small island in a Paris river, looked toward Notre Dame, and gave back to the silence the last thing he had. His life, offered without apology and without retraction, in defense of the truth of what his order had been. The fire went out. The silence returned. But it was not the silence of emptiness. It never had been.